On the 13th of November 2010, two British heavyweights would collide in a world title fight that would go down as one of British boxing's biggest embarrassments, and a fight that Eddie Hearn would love to pretend never happened in the first place, as he even described it as the worst night of his life. I'm of course talking about the infamous clash between WBA heavyweight champion of the world David Haye and former Olympic gold medalist Audley Harrison. But to get to that disappointing night in Manchester, we have to go back to how the fight originally came about in the first place. In the late 2000s, David Haye was by far the best cruiserweight in the world. He had captured nearly every belt, beating the likes of Jean-Marc Mormec in his backyard of France, where he was forced to come through adversity to eventually win by stoppage in round 7, which won him the WBA, WBC, Ring and Lineal Cruiserweight titles. He then put on a demolition job in the O2, where he beat Enzo Maccarinelli for the WBO world title. Haye had previously flirted with the idea of becoming a fully fledged heavyweight, but now he had become the best cruiserweight in the world. Haye felt it was the right time to make the move permanently, which he did in 2008 with the American Monty Barrett welcoming Haye to the glamour division of boxing. Haye would announce himself to the division by dropping Barrett multiple times, with the referee stopping the fight in round 5 following another knockdown. Haye would then get a favourable world title fight against the giant Russian Nikolai Valuev, where he would outpoint Valuev over 12 rounds to capture the WBA belt. And in his first defence of his world title in front of 20,000 in Manchester, Haye would put on a beating against the veteran John Ruiz to make his first successful defence of his world title. Haye was eager to get a fight with at least one of the Klitschko brothers, as they were still firmly in control of the heavyweight division. However, he wouldn't land the fight with either of the Klitschko brothers, as they fought Samuel Peter and Shannon Briggs instead. With the dream fight against the Klitschko brothers off the table, Haye and his team were approached by a young Eddie Hearn to make the fight with Haye's former amateur teammate and newly crowned European champion, Audley Harrison. Despite not being the most elite matchup Haye could take, the fight with Audley presented a massive payday, as despite Harrison's underwhelming pro career, he still had a big fan base and was still well known in the UK, which meant this fight had the potential to sell out a major arena. Harrison's route to this fight wasn't quite as glamorous as Haye's, as he was essentially fighting to save his career following multiple disappointing losses domestically, with a point decision loss to former Commonwealth champion Martin Rogan almost ending his career entirely. However, Harrison was starting to gain some momentum in his career when he won the prizefighter heavyweight tournament. This was a 8-man, one-night tournament mainly consisting of domestic level talent. The idea was created originally by the promotional company Matchroom, who at the time were half in and half out of boxing. They were one of many promotions that were working for Sky Sports at the time, and were really only putting on small hall shows in leisure centres. It was really a dark age for British boxing, to say the least. This is where the relationship originally began between Eddie Hearn and Harrison. Eddie was primarily working in the online gaming space, doing extremely well with poker. That was until he met Harrison. Despite not knowing too much about him, he was immediately impressed with him. Harrison had the size and the personality, and if Eddie could get his career back on track, he could still have a big future in the sport. The plan was for Harrison to get into prizefighter. If he won that, he would then advance to a fight for the European title, with the end goal being a massive fight against David Haye for the world title. Eddie was a perfect example of fake it until you make it, as he didn't even believe Harrison would win the tournament. However, to Eddie's surprise, Harrison pulled it off in what was a hugely successful show for Matchroom. As part of the plan, Eddie would get Harrison a shot at the vacant European heavyweight title. His opponent would be his old foe, Michael Sprott. Sprott stunned Harrison back in the English heavyweight title clash in 2007, knocking him out with a spectacular left hand. In their European title fight, it would look like it was going to be repeat rather than revenge, as Harrison was being dominated for the vast majority of the fight and even tore his pec. However, out of nowhere, with a punch from the gods, Harrison launched a massive left hand, which sent Sprott crashing to the canvas. Harrison was now the European champion and had successfully completed his end of the deal to get the fight with David Haye. The only issue now was that the fight with Haye was never actually agreed on in the first place, and that Eddie Hearn was just hoping that if Harrison had won his fights, he would be able to entice Haye and Adam Booth to accept the fight. Eddie would then go into full sales mode and pitch the fight to the British public and to Haye's team. Surprisingly, Haye and Booth would reach out to Eddie and the negotiations for the fight would begin. Despite Eddie's lack of knowledge at the negotiation table, having never really been involved in a major fight like this before, the fight was made and it would take place in the MEN Arena in Manchester on Sky Sports pay-per-view. I would love to be a fly on the wall at every house of those who bought that pay-per-view. With the fight signed, it was now time to sell the fights to the public, something Eddie did a little too well, as he had many convinced that Audley had a real chance to win this fight. Watching back this press conference is like watching a moment before a disaster. The promotional campaign was a huge success, and the nation bought into the fight. Eddie had done his job, and it was up to Harrison to back up his pre-fight promises. Billed as the biggest night in British boxing since Lennox Lewis beat Frank Bruno 17 years prior, the night would instead turn out to be one of the most embarrassing moments in the history of British boxing. In one of the biggest pay-per-views that Sky had ever done, or you could say the biggest legal robbery ever accomplished, Harrison would completely freeze on his biggest night of his life. The first round of the fight was extremely cagey, with both men fighting very cautiously. Things would start to pick up in round 2 following the referee requesting for more action from the two fighters, which was then met with loud cheers from the fans, who were beginning to get frustrated with the overly cautious start from both men. Although Haye was beginning to be more active, there was still nothing coming back from Harrison other than the odd jab or two, which weren't even landing. Round 3 was where we finally got to see the explosive and powerful Haye that we've come to expect, as Haye managed to get Harrison onto the ropes and unloaded a huge right hand which had Harrison in panic mode. Haye wouldn't let him off and would unleash a barrage of punches which put the European champion down. During this onslaught from Haye, there was zero resistance coming from Harrison. He was completely overwhelmed and had zero survival instinct. Harrison managed to get back to his feet, where Haye would immediately lunge into range and continue punishing Harrison with powerful combinations, which forced the referee to step in and stop the fight. In the entire fight, Harrison only managed to land 2 out of his 28 punches, both of which were jabs. Like I mentioned earlier, people actually had to pay for the privilege of watching that. I feel this YouTube comment perfectly sums up this fight. In the aftermath of the fight, fans and pundits quite rightfully criticised the timid performance of Harrison, and even the British Boxing Board of Control got involved and withheld some of Harrison's purse while they were investigating the fight. The fight was such a disaster, Eddie Hearn was questioning his future in the sport, saying, "I was certain I was finished in boxing." His credibility was at an all-time low. But in reality, Eddie did what all good promoters should do, and that's to sell a fight to the best of your ability. As for Harrison, he would go on to win another prize-fighter tournament before being brutally knocked out by the up-and-coming American star Deontay Wilder, which was the last we would see of Harrison in the ring. And well, Haye, he would go on to have a fairly underwhelming heavyweight career. If there's any lessons to be learnt here, it's that whatever pre-fight promise a fighter or a promoter gives means absolutely nothing when it comes to the fight itself. Eddie Hearn and David Haye are definitely going to go down as the best salesmen the sport has ever seen. Let me know in the comments below if you paid for this fight, and as always, thanks very much for watching.